You'd be surprised how hard it was to track down all the books Christians wrote in the first 2 centuries. Really, the reason I set out to do this was so I could read everything Christians wrote in that time period. And yes, you read that correctly. The New Testament is missing about 88% of all the books Christians wrote during that time, that we know of. The New Testament constitutes a mere 12%. I say Christian books to mean any theologically centered work written by a Christian, in other words, religious texts. In this video, I'll give you the entire list and crucial details about the text. The list will also be in the description, and if you want to email me, I can get you a special PDF with the list of texts and more info about each of them. Now, a couple things to mention before we get going here. I'm confident in saying the 88% figure is certainly wrong. There is far too much ambiguity in dating ancient texts to be able to give figures so precise. For many of these texts, scholars can at best give a century-long range in which a text may have been written. And while all this is far too much to mention in a title or thumbnail, I would provide something like a 20% margin of error for that number. And that's just speaking about texts that we know of. Because we don't know what we don't know, there could be far more Christian texts originating from this period than we can identify. It's almost certainly the case. And there are cases like Quella, Q, Matthew's special source, Luke's special source, all of which may have either been oral or written, and vague statements like that in Luke's prologue, all indicating there is a lot more to the picture than just what we see in our modern New Testament. All this being said, this video is going to give you a pretty good understanding of just how many Christian books are missing from the New Testament canon. This video isn't particularly going to focus on distinguishing between first and century texts. There's just far too much nuance to get into that for each one of these books for one video. However, I do want to make it clear that the New Testament does preserve most of the earliest and foundational texts in the Christian tradition. The Pauline corpus and the Gospels are the earliest and most important extant Christian works, and it seems to me these texts did originate in the 1st century. The date of composition for the Pseudo-Pauline corpus, the Catholic letters, and Revelation is a bit tougher to pin down, but it's safe to say these works are quite early, dating mid-2nd century at the latest and 80 CE at the earliest. 224 theological texts were written by Christians in the first 2 centuries that we know of, meaning from the year 1 to 200 CE. And we have just 27 books in our modern New Testament. Here are a few graphics so you can visualize the situation a little bit. What are the implications of this? Why were so many Christian texts left out of the canon? Firstly, the process by which the Christian canon came about was much more a grassroots type of development than an authoritative declaration by one person or a group of people. Texts first began to be seen as authoritative due to their content, organic use, and popularity among early Christian believers. Christian leaders began delineating which books would constitute an authoritative Christian corpus as early as the late 2nd century, but these books varied depending on the region. The earliest evidence we have of our exact New Testament books being canonized is in a letter written by an Alexandrian bishop in 367 CE. And I want to show you one of the earliest extant copies of this letter. I have it here. This is known, it's commonly cataloged as the Paris Greek 1085 manuscript, one of the earliest that still exists, although this one dates to roughly the 10th century, so still quite late. Originally written about 600 years before this copy was made. This manuscript still exists. There are other records in this manuscript, but here we see the 39th Festal letter that Athanasius of Alexandria wrote, and here he starts to list the books of the canon. These are Old Testament books, and after he's done listing the Old Testament books, he starts listing the books in the New Testament, which mirror exactly what we have in our modern New Testament. Here it says the evangelists are thus, and actually I'm more well-versed in Koine Greek, not this specific type of Greek, but here we see the Gospel of Matthew is the first one he lists. So he said, according to Matthew, and then here, according to Markon, kata Markon, and then Luke, John, kata Ioannin, and the list goes on. So I thought that was pretty interesting, and I wanted to share that with you. 10th century manuscript of the 39th Festal letter. You've seen it for yourselves. At the very least, what we can understand by these statistics is that if we read just the New Testament alone, we are blind to the vast majority of early Christian ideas and are largely ignorant of early Christian history. Within these formative centuries, Christians held drastically different ideas about who Jesus was, the nature of his relationship with Yahweh, his purpose, and if he was even a god at all. The New Testament is an early, somewhat homogeneous set of texts with similar doctrines, but thousands of other Christians viewed other texts in the same period as authoritative and divinely inspired as well. After centuries of contention, our list of New Testament works that we see today came to be seen as the only authoritative Christian canon. So here's the list of all Christian works in the first 2 centuries. I'll categorize them into 3 distinct types. The first is extant Christian literature. These extant Christian texts are those which were written in the first 2 centuries at some point and still exist today in a complete form. The second type is fragmentary Christian literature. These are texts of which only a fragment or a small piece of text remains, usually quoted by a church father in one of their works, or sometimes preserved in a small piece of a manuscript. And the third category is non-extant Christian literature. These texts are mentioned by early authors as existing in their time or having existed in the past. However, they do not preserve any of the text within the work. They either only give the name of the text or indicate that something was written by an individual. This is a list of all extant Christian works of the first 2 centuries. There are 145 texts. This is the list of all Christian works of which only fragments remain. There are 32 books. It's often difficult to tell if an author is quoting one work or several works. In these questionable cases, it's assumed that the quoted text derives from only one text from the cited author. In clearer cases, which unambiguously identify multiple texts, each text is specified. In certain cases, a later author will not give a title of the work from which a fragment comes, but only give its author. In this case, only the name of the author is given. And here's the list of all non-extant Christian works that we know of. There are 47. Since you're interested in really old books, you'll probably want to know the date of the earliest existing New Testament manuscript. In other words, the oldest piece of paper that exists with New Testament text on it. That kind of gets confusing because the New Testament refers to the Old Testament in some parts, so I'm not talking about that specifically. What I mean to say is the oldest piece of paper that represents text from a New Testament work. Click this video to find out. If you have any questions about anything, just ask. I might be able to lend some insight. I try to reply to all the comments, and you can also email me if you want. Check out the bibliography, and let's talk about any ideas you may have.